You're listening to Magic from Wherever I'm At with your host, the magician, time traveler, and charmer, Dartagnan.
Welcome to another edition of the podcast. I am Dartagnan, and today is the start of a three-part series, my review of Juan Tamariz's The Magic Rainbow, something that a few people have been waiting for, longing for perhaps, and today's the day it begins. Now, before we begin, I should like to say that everyone should read The Magic Rainbow, and aspects of which you'll understand as this three-part series unravels or is revealed. But for the general sake of, if you are a magician, you should avail yourself of all the latest books, big event books, let's call them, that come onto the market so that you can at least enter the discussion or formulate your own opinions as to the validity of the advice or the thoughts of the given author. Now, I've always been a big proponent of the idea that it's never who is saying whatever they're saying that you should really value. It is what is being said and the validity of the advice being given based on its own merit and not based on anything to do with the dispenser, right? And this is a very basic sort of law of logic, where you ignore the authority of the person talking and instead evaluate the value of the information itself. And this book, when I saw it first come out, and I held a copy in my hands that my friend Steve Reynolds had in his possession, when I was able to thumb through it a bit for maybe like less than an hour, I noticed some interesting things. And then later when I got my own copy, I was able to read it 3 or 4 times. I think I've read it 4 times now, and sort of evaluate these things on my own. Now, one of the first things I saw, of course, and magic is known as a backslappy, everything's okay, you're doing great, Johnny, sort of self-esteem. It was the self-esteem movement before self-esteem movement was popular. We don't want to criticize anything in magic because that would just, hurt people's participation or offend them so they won't come back. And a large part of the magic community is, of course, people who are not professional performers. In fact, like 99% of people are not professional performers. And so in order to cultivate an audience for which to sell things to you need to, prop that up with this self-esteem movement that has long since been in magic, which is basically everything that anybody does is okay. And I'm of the opposite opinion, which is that most of magic is in fact crap. And that self-esteem aspect to it is one of the main reasons behind that. And that the longer that goes on, the worse magic gets. And although magic is found on many forms of media nowadays, almost all of it is reprehensibly terrible. And so if you've listened to this podcast at all, of course, you know that already. This is not new news to you. I'm highly critical of contemporary magic because I believe it is an outcropping of this idea that the tricks are what drive magic instead of whatever meaning or artistry one wants to put into it. And so there's very little, or very few, I would say, magicians, but lots of tricksters, to borrow a term I have many times from the actual magic literature. If you go back and read a lot of the periodicals, they referred to people who didn't make presentations and didn't take magic seriously or put it in its best light as a trickster. And so I've adopted that on this podcast. And reading through some of these reviews, early reviews of the Magic Rainbow, from people who are supposedly prominent in magic, including a few people I would consider world-class performers. When I then read the book, it made me doubt those performers' understanding of magic. And it also made me further solidified that idea that, people are just sort of backslapping their friends and not being at all critical or not evaluating the actual merit of what is being said. And having waited a long time for this book to come out, I've enjoyed a lot of Juan Tamariz's books. I've learned a few things along the way. I wouldn't say he's had a massive impact on my magic, but I've certainly enjoyed reading his books and his ideas, and I think some of them are extremely valid. But I was, once I had this book in my hands, in terms of being able to read it cover to cover over and over and making notes and stuff, I became actually pretty disenchanted with this book and rather disappointed. Now, this 3-part series I've decided to call The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. Of course, it's impossible to cover this massive tome in sort of 3 parts, I don't think. So I'm going to pick sort of 3 distinct aspects that I think are the most important of this book. Although there are some great parts and there are some not so great parts, obviously. I'm going to highlight the parts I think are the best, and I'm going to highlight the parts that I think are the worst, and I'm going to highlight the parts that I think are the most convoluted and or misanalyzed, perhaps, or the advice that I think is wholly confusing and or wrong. So today's episode, we're going to start on a positive note for those people who hate to hear critical commentary. Probably should not listen to this podcast, but we're going to start with the good. This is the overly positive section of the podcast today, because there's a section in this book which I think is one of the best sections in any magic book, and for that reason you should avail yourself of reading it. And it has to do with something I first heard about many moons ago, and then I saw briefly commented upon by Tamariz himself in the documentary Our Magic, the R. Paul Wilson documentary put out by Dan and Dave, or whoever it was, which he talks about the 7 veils. And this is the most important part of the book, I think, because this really speaks to things that are occurring to your audience that maybe they feel but don't understand. And this is sort of the vibe that comes from people where the audience, I often like to say the audience, they may be stupid. They may not understand certain things in some instances, but they are not oblivious. And what I mean by that is some of which is contained in this 7 veil idea, which is they feel these things. They may not be able to intellectually, put their finger on exactly what's going on and why, but they receive these vibes. They receive this knowledge intuitively about a performer, which leads to them liking or disliking the performance or however it goes. So we're going to start with the 7 veils. First, he says these 7 magic veils cover magical mysteries and artistic aspects that are felt by the audience despite the spectators being unaware that these things exist. They are felt without knowing why. The feeling, not unveiling those mysteries, is to dance to the true performance art of magic, in Tamariz's words. Let's talk about those veiled mysteries. So the first veil is the mystery of love for what you do. Now he says the love of magic, it's useless if it's not passionate. You train, you rehearse, you study, you read, you talk, you dig deep into magic without obligation, now he says without an objective, and I'll get back to that in a second. for its own sake, for affection, for communicating with other magicians, men and women who love magic as we do, and love for what you do, for our craft, for the history of our art, for those who devote themselves to it, is perceived by the audience. Now it says without an objective, and I don't agree with that particular aspect thrown in there. Most of those other things are fine. But the objective really of digging into the magic art is to perform. That's one thing that is overlooked. I think maybe Tamariz himself here actually takes that for granted because it says is perceived by the audience. Right? So that to him, without an objective means like he's assuming you're going to perform. And that's not a natural assumption. As you look at the landscape of the magic community, there's not a lot of performing going on if you were to take everybody contained within the quote-unquote magic community. So it's not without an obligation. The obligation is to get up and perform, as I have detailed in the very first episode of this podcast. Now, they enjoy seeing our love for what we present. They immerse themselves in that joy, that love, that passion. So he's saying that this passion that you have for magic is what comes across and strikes the audience, and they immerse themselves in the joy that we show because of all these things, because of our love, because of our study, because of our rehearsal. But of course, most people in magic don't do any of those things. And that, I believe, has led to a cheapening of the art. Because if you're getting from a performance that you don't love it as much as perhaps people would think, and you don't rehearse and study and put any real work into like presentation, for example, that's going to come across to the audience. And when that stuff is non-existent, they feel that, just as like they feel someone who has put in the work. That's why people now say vastly different things to me now, today, than they did when I started. Their comments are much, much different. They no longer say, I don't know how you did that. Right? Stuff like that. It's moved far beyond that. That's because because I really do love magic. I study, I rehearse, I make presentations, I dig into the history of magic, which a lot of people involved in magic don't do either. So I'm well read on that stuff, which comes from my love, right? And he says, why do they perceive it? Why can they distinguish the artist who loves what he does from another who, even when more skilled, apparently, than the former, doesn't touch them as deeply with his art? And that's the crux, right? Someone can be so-called skilled, very skilled with like the sleight of hand, let's say, for instance, skilled at doing the tricks, but they're not as touched, the audience is not touched as deeply as the person whose love and artistry and other aspects beyond just the skill are used to touch the audience, and they hold that person in higher esteem than the person who's only skilled at the mechanical, methodological nature of it. They can feel that. And he says, how can the spectator know all that without anyone telling them? It's a mystery. Only Fraxon knows it, he puts here. But it's not a mystery, I don't think. It may be a mystery to the audience. It may be one of these things, like he's saying, a veil that they can't put their finger on. But it's all these things that he's already mentioned that most people calling themselves magicians don't do. And that's why the audience is able to feel this from people who do that and not, and thus segregate their opinion about these kind of people. The second veil, the mystery of effort, and this follows on directly from the first veil. The more you love what you do, the easier it is to devote more constant and thorough effort to rehearse, effort to learn, to train, to fine-tune, to improve, to perfect. If I perform a trick that I bought, he uses as an example here, the secret of which relies on something mechanical, even if it's ingenious, but it demands little or no effort from the performer, no matter how wonderful the effect is, the spectators can feel, and I don't know how, he says, the lack of effort on my part. And this follows on directly from the first part. And this is a very interesting statement Tamariz makes here, because this completely contradicts what he says later And I'll get to that in part 2 of this podcast. So he says, the audience senses an absence of dedication. They don't like the trick as much. They don't feel it as much. They don't love it as much. But if I've devoted time, energy, enthusiasm, effort, hard but joyful work on the technique, the digital, the corporeal, the psychological, to the emotional structure, the pattern, its adaptation to my personality, even though the effect might appear the same or even inferior to that of another trick to which I devoted no effort, the spectators will like the first one more. They will feel it more and they won't know why. But he's laid out why this does that. Right? Because, and this is what I'm talking about, when most people calling themselves magicians only do the trick, and that takes a degree of effort depending on how demanding the sleight of hand is or how demanding the procedural aspects are. But you're still only doing a small, maybe 20, 15, 20%. You've still neglected the other 80%, which is the framing, the presentation, the patter, the personality of the magician, how that corresponds. How does the presentation drive the show itself forward? How is it connected to the other tricks in the show? All these kind of things is what people ignore 99% of the time. And guess what? The audience, as Tamariz says here, they feel that. They know it. And they don't really know why, and they may not even be able to put it into words. But they'll know that you didn't put in the effort. They know that you didn't rehearse, that you didn't put in that other 80%. They know, and that's the whole point. He says it's a mystery how they feel that, right? Because it's an intensity of energy, a concentration of time spent, all this work you've put into something, picking the right words. You know, in other podcasts, I've belabored the point that when I hang around with other magicians, very rarely do we talk, other people who actually perform. Very rarely do we talk about the sleights and stuff like that. It's all talking about the words to use, the framing of the trick. What presentation could I use here? How does my character's, what would my character do at this point? What would he say? Right? All those kind of things. It's got very little to do with the tricks. Let's move on. The third veil. The third veil is the mystery of knowledge and wisdom. If I do a trick and I know who invented it, and I know the evolution of the trick and its variants, its versions, I know who performed it, I have found out about its author or authors, then when I present it, the audience senses my knowledge of the trick, and it affects them more deeply. So here again, he's hammering home with these first 3 veils that you should basically get off your lazy fucking ass and do some real work. Learn about the history of the trick you're doing. Learn about all its variations, all the people who've performed it and the different ways they've gone about presenting it. Really delve in. This is what separates people who are artists and people who only call themselves artists and don't choose to present. They just do the method. And the people witnessing this, they can feel it. They may smile, they may clap, they may give you money, but God forbid should you ever be seen before or after somebody who's doing what Tamariz is suggesting here, because you'll look like a second-rate hobo compared to the next person who is doing these things. So he says, again, how do the spectators know? I don't know. It's a mystery. They can feel it, right? He says the same things happen with the entire session. So what he's saying is the whole show. If I know more sleights than the ones I use, if I know more tricks than the ones I perform, if I am versed in more branches of magic than the ones I show in that session, if I know more magicians, witnessed more sessions, read more books, attended more conventions, I know the history of magic magicians in depth, all that knowledge, all that undisplayed wisdom, it brings depth and artistic authorship to the performance and to the magician. And they just feel that, right? How do they feel it? We don't know. He says it's a mystery. The fourth veil is the mystery of energy. How is the vital energy of the magician transmitted? How does it reach the spectators? I'm not referring to the rhythm or the speed or overacting or screams or false attitudes, postures, or exaggerated actions. I'm referring to when there is an inner energy that comes from and is transmitted through the solar plexus to the spectators. And it hits them and embraces them and moves them and makes them vibrate. Where does it originate? How is it transmitted? Is there an intellectual, a physical, or an emotional energy? How are the batteries of those energies charged? He says health is essential. You should be intellectually clear of mind. You should park all your negative emotions, before the performance. And transmit all your enthusiasm stuff strongly and powerfully because you have a love for it and you should have a deep knowledge of it. Then and only then can I make the audience explode with heartfelt applause, unloading the excess of the powerful, almost physically unbearable energy received. But once again, how do we transmit this energy that you can almost touch but can't see? Waves, vibrations, it's a mystery. So he's talking about how there's this certain, when you see certain people, for example, when I saw Leonard Green for the first time on those green magic videos, I was watching a video. I wasn't there live, right? This is a performance that happened many years before I saw it. And yet his enthusiasm, his energy, his knowledge, all led to this love that almost like, if you've ever seen the Care Bears, it was a cartoon about these, they had toys, these little bears, and they all had little symbols on their chests. And they did this whole thing where the symbol shot power out of their chest. And they all got together, they all sort of combined to do that to affect a good outcome from something. That's kind of what's going on here in a weird way, is what he's saying. When you get this enthusiasm, it's like infectious. When I watched Leonard Green, I couldn't help but laughing out loud, even though I was by myself. I couldn't help but laugh as he juxtaposed the things, as he pretended to use a calculator to calculate the card trick. All these things that I've shared about the Leonard Green episodes and some of the trailers and teasers I made for those episodes. I got sucked into his enthusiasm. He had this charisma and this magnetic quality to his performance because he'd done all these things that Tamariz is talking about. He'd put in the work. He had the knowledge. He had rehearsed. He had constructed these presentations. He'd done the work. And when you love something, you do the work. That's how it works. Let's move on to the fifth veil. The fifth veil is the mystery of truth. Now he says the most essential thing in the art of deception is truth. It's a great paradox. The truth of everything above, of the previous mysteries, truth in the love of what you do. Not that it seems as if, but that it is. And true, not pretended energy, and true joy, not a stereotype smile. Truly feeling the magical effect. Even though the phenomenon we present is not real, the emotions that resonate with it and that we feel, both of us, the magician and spectator, are real. There's artistic truth. The better the performer, there's a strange half paradox here. He says, the better the performer, the more expressive, the greater his capacity for communication, the more easily he will betray that he is acting. If he fakes it, it will be noticed that he's actually sad, but wants to feign joy. It is easier for him to communicate sincerity and truth when they're genuine. So he talks about how there's an example here where he used to say, I don't want to see the card, and he would, other magicians would blindfold themselves. He says, I don't need to. He would take off his glasses. But eventually he had a cataract operation which corrected his myopia, so he can see perfectly. And as a result, because he could now see perfectly, he took that gag out because he didn't think it was authentic. And it was more of a put-on. Now, some people get behind this kind of thinking. Michael Weber's another person. If you listen to his podcast, he's kind of the same ilk. Jerry Andrus always talked about this kind of stuff. But I think at the heart of this, what he's really going on is like, is this something authentic coming from you? Is this yourself, the real you, being spilled out into what you're doing? Right? Because this is no longer, when he's talking about the cataract thing, he's talking about this no longer being true. So it has no real basis. You could still do it. You'd still get a laugh. But again, the audience knows the difference, he's saying. That's what this whole veil thing is about. The audience can feel the difference between something that's real and yet maybe part of the deception versus something that's unreal. That's just copy and pasted, essentially. And this is what makes not coming up with your own presentations and stuff extremely weak. Because you'll still get some laughs, you'll still get some applause and stuff, and people will still like it. They'll clap and stuff, and they'll seem to like it. But they'll always feel that this presentation that you just took from somebody else and just used whole hog is not coming from you. That's what he's saying here. They can feel that. How? We don't know, is what he's saying. But there's an artistic truth. Right? That's why the character that you're portraying is an extension of you. Because all that stuff that's the extension, although it may be put on steroids to some degree, is truthful of you as a person, as a real person. It's your kind of humor. It's things you care about personally. It's experiences you've had, but maybe put into a different context. And the audience can feel that when it's coming from you directly versus you've taken it, copy and pasted it, and slapped it in there. And that's basically what he's talking about. The audience feels and perceives it, but how? It's a mystery. And he really goes into this part here where he says the truth applies to the whole of our art, to the truth of style and the truth of personalities. He says, out copies, out rip-offs. Regarding the truth of the magician's personality, the most important thing of all, if there's a humbleness, it should be genuine. Charm or fascination, they should be artistically true. Humor, right? Your kind of humor. All these things, all that you're bringing to the table is coming from within. That's why taking, like, you see a lot of people use Eugene Berger's gypsy thread routines, one of his gypsy thread routines. It doesn't resonate in the same way as it does for Eugene Berger because Eugene Berger created that from within. And then he worked on it and continued to refine it, working on it and molding it closer and closer to essentially his artistic truth. Right? So when you take that whole hog and put that in your show and you do it, you'll still get a fairly good response, but it won't be the same. And that's because it didn't come from you. And that's why you should do your own stuff and create your own presentations, create your own extend yourself character-wise out from your real persona. So the sixth veil, he says, is the mystery of a rich inner world. How can the audience know that the inner world of a magician is rich and therefore full of interest? How does the audience find out the magician is cultivated, not simply knowledgeable, that he has experienced pain and passion, joy and love, fear and sadness, that he has fought and lost and fallen and then recovered, that he's grounded and feels nature, that he has developed an inner spirituality, that he's delved into other allied arts, that he's not free of contradictions. He still has doubts and hesitations and therefore deeply human and worthy member of mankind. How do the spectators of a show know all that? I don't know how they know. He says it's a deep mystery. But this is one of the things where people say, I had a friend of mine say to me, God, once upon a time, he said, how's a show supposed to go? We were looking at we were watching some people, and he was trying to come up. I said, your show should have some kind of a theme. And he said, like, well, what's a theme? What can I see? But I said, but all this stuff, whatever the theme is going to be, whatever the idea that's going to join everything together, that's got to come from you. You're the artist. You're expressing this stuff. You know, I saw the movie A Star is Born, which is a remake of a remake of a remake, the one with Lady Gaga, Bradley Cooper. And early on in that film, when Bradley Cooper's character, Jackson Maine, first meets Lady Gaga's character, he takes her to a police bar, and he starts asking her if she sings her own music. And she says she's afraid to, and people have told her she can't make it because of her nose and all this kind of stuff. And in that scene, he says something that encapsulates exactly why copying and pasting and ripping off other presentations and using patter lines of other people and stuff just never really works.
Look, talent comes everywhere. Everybody's talented. I bet you fucking everybody in this bar is talented in one thing or another, but having something to say and the way to say it so people listen to it, that's a whole other bag. And unless you get out there and you try to do it, you'll never know. That's just the truth. If there's one reason we're supposed to be here is to say something so people want to hear it.
And later on in the same film, his brother, when they get into a fight, his older brother says, if I'm so terrible, why did you steal my voice? Because I guess the Jackson Maine character basically adopted his brother's gravelly voice, affected his brother's gravelly voice. And Jackson Maine's response is, because you had nothing to say. I took it because you were never going to use it because you don't have anything to say. And that's really what I'm saying on this podcast. If you go back to the very beginning and listen, the through line of this whole thing is basically, if you are truly an artist and you are going to raise your magic to a level of artistry, then you should have something to say, something to get off your chest, something you want, and you're going to infuse that into your work. So that's what he's talking about here. If you don't have anything to say, if you got something to say, people are going to feel it. And it's kind of ironic coming from Tamariz, as we'll cover in the second episode, because I don't think he fulfills his end of the bargain on this. Now we get to the last veil, which is the mystery of love. The seventh veil, the mystery of love. He says, but there's a love that's different from that of loving the art. He says, this is about the love of the personalities of the spectators. And this seventh veil, I think, is probably the most important of all. And I've certainly seen this play out as to like how good performances hit an audience versus terrible performances, or performances that don't resonate despite the fact that they may have miraculous effects and stuff in them. And Tamariz goes on to say, for the people who are there to see you and enjoy and feel and have fun, who return your love, and I'm not talking about the love in the uppercase, literary or grand love. I'm referring to affection, of human sympathy in artistic joy, and an immense pleasure of sharing experience of the impossible, of the spectator's sympathy and empathy with the personality of the magician, with that man or woman who produces and transmits the extremely beautiful emotion of the art. And he says that's how the sending and receiving of energy and emotion and affection and play and joy are mysteriously transmitted. And I've seen this so many times in person, it's astounding. But it's very obvious to me now. And it was always obvious to me, and I experienced much of what Tamariz is talking about here, where I could feel that the performer did not like the people, did not have a love for the personalities of the audience. And it was very obvious to me that these people should not be performing. This is not for them. And I've seen that over and over. They have a love of the methods and the tricks and all the stuff that is the least important aspects of magic. And this may be the most important aspect of magic, period. Because ultimately, if you don't have this, you have nothing, no matter how skillful or creative you are. Because if you don't love the audience, if you don't want to be there with them, experiencing and sharing it with them, and becoming essentially, for the moments that you're together, a family of sorts, which I talked about on one of the Tommy Wonder podcasts about how you created this house that you're all going to live in for the moments that you're together, then they're going to feel that. And they're not going to like your performance as much as the next person. They may still, this is what people get mistake. They mistake the things of like people clapping and saying, oh, that's good and stuff. Because until they see somebody else who's done this stuff. And for most people, you don't run into many magicians. And that's the only thing saving the people who don't have love for the audience, is that people don't meet many real magicians. And so the people who are weak on these aspects I've talked about in this episode are essentially safe for a good chunk of the time. They won't be outed. They won't be found and discovered and criticized and shown up for their deficiencies. They won't be shown up as charlatans who claim they love magic but don't put in the work. And for a while there, I would feel these things myself watching other people perform, but not really truly understand why I was thinking that. And then I, over time, being exposed to it over and over again, and started thinking about these things, I realized that they just didn't like the audience. They didn't have an appreciation for people, just in general, not even people in their audience, just really a people. They're not interested in other people. And if you want to be a performer, good luck. Good luck. So that's it basically for today. The Seven Veils, for me, was the highlight of The Magic Rainbow by Juan Tamariz. It's the best part of the book, I think, hands down, going away, no contest. Because it actually puts labels and information, detail to some of these things that are felt by the spectators, by the audience, and some of the reasoning behind why they're feeling that, or basically what's transmitting that to the audience and how they're picking that up, and what contributes to those different seven veils. So that's it for today's episode. It's a long one, 38. I'm sure these ones will be pretty long. But that's all I have for today. So we'll be back again next week. If you want to reach me, of course, I'm Dartagnan Magic on all social media. It's magicfromwherever.com. If you go to the Anchor page, which has, it's anchor.fm/magic from wherever I'm at, all with hyphens in between the words. You can leave a voice message. You can go to my website, magicfromwherever.com, and there's a link to the page there. You can go there and leave a voice message, which I can actually use in the podcast. So hopefully this year people will do that, because I can actually include the voice clip in the podcast and highlight some of the things you guys have to say, which would be great to make this a little more interactive. I have plans for the 100th episode, which is now 15 episodes away. Maybe going to do or for sure going to do a live episode where I take questions, perform perhaps, do a number of things. So for that, that wraps up today's episode of The Good. Next week will be The Bad, followed by The Ugly. That's all I have for today. Thank you for listening.